Let me open with prayer this morning.
Yeah.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for the time to become and have fellowship with our Christian brothers and sisters. We ask now that you send the Holy Spirit to unite us together with you as one. And may the messages delivered today guide and give us paths for progressive and Christian fellowship in the future. We ask this in Christ's name.
Amen.
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 Ted, I'm going to share my screen and mute myself. So.
Yeah, you should be good to go.
Okay, Dave? Good, Al, you ready to go? Okay. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Okay, first slide. Give me the first slide, Dave. No, this is not Pocahontas, despite the Disney company and your grandkids or great can't what your great kids, grandkids or great grandkids tell you. And this is not Pocahontas either. It's some artist model dressed like a Hollywood version of an Indian princess. And this is most certainly not Pocahontas, despite the 1/1000th of Native American DNA in her blood. This may be as close to the real Pocahontas as we can get, although it was actually how the British saw her as a Christian convert named Rebecca Rolfe when she visited London in 1616. But the story behind the real Pocahontas is only part of what I'm going to cover today. Another part is how about 4 English boys who came with the early settlers to Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in the New World. What made these adolescents special is that they were embedded into the Chesapeake Algonquin Indian tribes around Jamestown to find out as much as they could about this strange new culture in this alien land. And the rest of my story is about our earliest ancestors embarking on one of the most daring, ill-begotten, faltering, occasionally heroic pioneering efforts, and the indigenous native tribes that they encountered, who tolerated them at first, then tried to wipe them out, found that they couldn't, and learned they had to live with them much to their ever-dying regret. This swatch of American history is borrowed from a book I read during the last year. It was based on original research done by an emeritus history professor at New York University named Karen Ordall Copperman. England was at the beginning of the 17th century, found itself in a burgeoning competition with other European powers to establish a permanent presence on the North American continent. English seamen were quite familiar with the Atlantic. They fished the bountiful Outer Banks around Newfoundland. Privateers or pirates attacked Spanish ships in the Caribbean and Atlantic and shared 20% of the loot with the British government. But the English maritime prowess was much different than founding and maintaining a fixed populated colony. Ireland was England's only colony at the time and always a volatile one. So in 1606, King James I issued a royal charter to private investors to form a joint stock company. A small group of aristocrats and merchants created the Virginia Company, named for Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, with the intent to plant a colony in the New World that could exploit natural resources, new markets for English goods, and exert leverage against Spanish and French settlements. One overwhelming weakness with these planners was that they had little knowledge about who and what was needed. A large number of gentlemen were among the first colonists. Problem was, English gentlemen didn't do manual labor, and skilled craftsmen and innovative leaders were critical to success. Nevertheless, the first ships bound for Virginia, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, left England in December 1606 and arrived on the banks of the southernmost main tributary, emptying into the vast Chesapeake Bay on May 14th, 1607. 104 men and boys. Notably absent were women, which should have told them something about their survival chances that first year. The leaders picked a small peninsula nestled in a turn in the river. They wanted to be able to detect Spanish galleons sailing the bay with ill intentions. But the site was swampy, ripe for disease, with no source of fresh water. The commander was Captain Christopher Newport, and he was ready to turn around and go back to England almost immediately. Most new arrivals were not adaptable pioneers. Whose land were they intruding upon with their outsized hubris? Over 30 native tribes lived along the more than 150 creeks, streams, and rivers that flowed into what they called Kichi-Sepiak, meaning the land along the big river. In fact, the Chesapeake is the largest estuary in North America, where the salt tides of the Atlantic meet fresh water at some point. Tribal territory stretched from Tidewater, Virginia, north to the large Potomac River and to parts of the eastern shore. It covered approximately 100 miles by 100 miles altogether. Wahun Seneca was the paramount chief, although each tribe had its own chief. Wahun Seneca was a Pamunkey Indian. Because he ruled over so many tribes who paid tribute to him, the English saw him as king or emperor, or the Powhatan. Thus, all the people over which he had dominion became known as the Powhatans. They spoke an Algonquin language, as did many tribes along the East Coast. It was estimated that the Powhatan Confederacy encompassed as many as 25,000 individuals at its peak. They were not militant, although they could not be pushed around or easily fooled. They had their own forms of government and religion. Chief Powhatan was shrewd, a consummate diplomat and calculator. The tribes cultivated the land, grew corn or maize, beans, a variety of potatoes and vegetables. They caught crabs so big they boasted they could feed 4 people. And oysters were so readily available, one could scoop them up for an easy meal. Surrounding woods and fields yielded grapes, plums, cherries, strawberries, walnuts, chestnuts, peas. Men and boys hunted deer and wild game. Women were the agriculturalists, the growers and harvesters, which gave them virtual equality with men in critical tribal decisions. At first, the Powhatans were curious and tolerant of the English, but they must have been wary because many of the newcomers were soldiers with muskets, and they quickly built a fort that did not look exactly welcoming. The Indians had called these broad, rich lands home since at least 400 AD. They'd had some contact with ships, mostly Spanish, reconnoitering the Chesapeake, and they may have known of an earlier colony embedded by Sir Walter Raleigh further south at Roanoke in 1585. He had abandoned it for 3 years, and when he returned, he found no trace. His colonists had died or joined native communities that would accept them. The Powhatans and the English were about as different as two cultures could be. So leadership on both sides recognized that they needed to learn about each other for strategic and communal reasons. The Indians wanted to grasp the real purpose behind this unexpected thrust into their proprietary territory. And the English wanted to know who these seeming wild people on the other side of the world were. Would they help or hinder them? Would they supply food if needed? Would they wipe them out, which was entirely possible based on numbers? Both came up with similar solutions, but from diametrically opposed angles. Pocahontas was 10 years old when the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607. The most beautiful, intelligent, and personable of Chief Powhatan's children. She began visiting the new arrivals, but not just in a casual manner. She was always accompanied by a small party of her father's men, and her presence signaled peaceful designs. A female overture was a well-established sign of benign intentions in native missions. The most important leader of Jamestown was John Smith. He was a tough, resourceful man who invented himself several times. He'd fought in the ongoing religious wars on the European continent when he was in his teens. Then he served in the Habsburg armies, pushing back the advance of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. He was knighted on the fields of battle, but eventually captured, sold into slavery, and served a high-born young woman in Istanbul. Smith escaped and made it back to England just in time to hook on with a Virginia company and sail for the New World. During the fall and winter of 1607, Jamestown inhabitants faced desperate times. Virginia was in the grip of a devastating drought that hadn't been seen in 700 years. Within 6 months, 2/3 of the original colonists were dead, mostly from starvation. John Smith decided he had to take matters into his own hands, or Jamestown would go the way of the lost colony of Roanoke. He set out to explore further up the network of rivers that flowed into the James River, on which the fort was located. His venture ended in his capture and the deaths of all the soldiers that went with him. Smith's captors were the Pamukees. He was eventually marched into Wicomico, Chief Powhatan's capital. Now, we've all heard how John Smith's life was saved by Pocahontas, and I'm sure Disney portrayed it in a dramatic and glorious technicolor, but there are debated versions of how it all went down. After feasting, Smith was dragged between two great stones where he was forced to lay. Men with clubs were ready to beat his brains in when the young Pocahontas came forward and interceded. Her father could not resist the appeals of his dearest daughter to spare him. What may have been going on, according to the book I read by scholar Kupperman, was an elaborate pretense. Pocahontas' intervention may have been cleverly scripted by Chief Powhatan. Smith was said to have been symbolically stripped of his life as an Englishman and reborn as a Powhatan. The chief saw Smith's capture as an opportunity to make him as his client or vassal, and to use him to get manufactured goods he valued from the colony. The chief asked for 2 great guns, probably the ship's cannon, and a grindstone. Just as an aside, the natural question was why didn't the Indians just wipe out Jamestown or let the colonists totally starve? But Powhatan and his tribes had a substantial knowledge of what the newcomers had to offer. Tools made of metal, axes, knives, swords, hoes, and kettles, not to mention guns. It was easier to cut down a tree with an axe made of iron or steel than one made of stone. A metal hoe made farming fields less tedious. Chief Powhatan was able to glean much of this knowledge from visits by Pocahontas. After Smith's capture and redemption, she and the official emissaries accompanying her brought badly needed food for the colonists. One of the first colonists to record his accounts of the Jamestown experience was a man named William Strachey. In the grim reality of the fort, where most of the men felt like prisoners because they did not dare go beyond the walls, Pocahontas's visits were welcome relief from the deprivations and boredom that they suffered through. He described her as a playful 11 or 12-year-old doing naked cartwheels. She and her entourage were there most likely for ulterior motives, to find out what these interlopers were up to. The English came at their intelligence gathering in a more unique and circuitous way. In the first English fleet that sailed to America was 13-year-old Thomas Savage. The fleet's commander, Admiral Newport, gave Savage to Chief Powhatan as sort of a gift when they met for the first time. The boy lived in the chief's home, village of Werwomaco. He knew Pocahontas. Another boy, Samuel Collier, sailed on the first fleet too. Captain John Smith left Collier with the chief of the Weeraskoyaks, who lived east of Jamestown on the same river. 14-year-old Henry Spelman came on the Second Virginia Company voyage in 1608. Smith gave Spelman to Parahunt, Chief Powhatan's son, who ruled the chief's birthplace further inland near what is now Richmond. Robert Poole arrived in Jamestown in 1611 and was sent to live with Opchancanow, an influential kinsman of Powhatan, and his eventual successor as paramount chief. Savage, Spelman, and Poole played crucial roles in the English immigration venture. Today, we would say they were embedded into the lives and villages of key Powhatan decision makers. They were supposed to build relationships and to learn the culture of the other from the inside, and especially the language, so they could interpret. It was a challenge and sometimes hazardous. The cultures of the English and the Chesapeake Algonquin were as different as the earth and the other side of the moon. And it was not easy to learn a language where words and meanings had no translatable equivalents. The boys were also designated to pass messages back and forth. Often they had to improvise and to try to make both sides understand, because meanings could be subtle, or one side might outright lie to the other, and the boys knew it. More than once, their own sense of loyalty was compromised. They were living day in and day out with the Powhatans. It was not surprising they came to like them and admire the many aspects of their way of life. But they were expected to remain wholly English and not betray their fellow countrymen. Why did the English select mere boys, adolescents in their early teens, to walk an often dangerous line between these two cultures? In the 16th and 17th centuries, youth or adolescence was called the non-age. It was a dark and difficult stage of life to English parents. The solution for many families was putting sons and daughters into servitude. Most boys and girls were placed as servants in another family's home by the time they were 13 or 14. Many youthful boys went abroad as soldiers in the European wars, like John Smith, or they went to sea as ship's boys. English adolescents were neither children nor adults. Shakespeare equated youth to being unbaked and doughy. But this doughiness was believed to make them malleable, able to adjust to new circumstances, and capable of learning new languages. Their youth made them less threatening to the people in which they were embedded. They adapted rapidly to new dress, habits, customs, food, and living arrangements. And the English saw the youth as more expendable than full-grown adults. If the Indians wanted to get rid of them or use them in any way they saw fit, so be it. The choices of boys the English made seem to have been strategically astute. Although he had to be apprehensive as Chief Powhatan's English boy, Thomas Savage was treated as an honored guest and quickly settled into Indian life. In warm weather, he wore only a deerskin a loincloth and moccasins. He slept on a bench in a longhouse surrounded by other tribal members. He may have cut his hair Indian style, shorn to the skin on the right of his head so it wouldn't hinder their aim when they drew their bowstrings back. On the other side, they grew at shoulder length. Incidentally, when the dandies heard about this style back in safe, secure London, they copied it, and long drapes of hair became known as love locks. I threw in this picture just to see if they were all still awake. Thomas Savage spent 3 years with Powhatan before the chief sent him back to Jamestown when relations with the English deteriorated. Henry Spelman was the only embedded boy who kept a regular journal. He recorded many Powhatan life experiences he witnessed firsthand. How Indian boys of 13 or 14 went through an elaborate ritual called Huskenow, where they retreated deep into the woods to prove their manhood. How communities joined together to flush out deer with fire on an annual hunt. How they planted beans around their corn stalks, so the beans furnished the corn with fertilizing nitrogen as it grew. How Native women took ownership of the fields, which gave them a power and authority that English women could only imagine. It was all part of an elaborate plan to use the boys as couriers, interpreters, intermediaries, even spies and power brokers. They were torn by their assignments. The more they came to understand the viewpoint of the people they had been forced to live with, the harder it was to disregard their interests. And the more conflicts and violence erupted between the two cultures, the more danger they found themselves in. They often had to balance on the edge of a knife that cut both ways. Chief Powhatan was not one to be duped. Despite the seemingly friendly gesture of placing Thomas Savage with him, Powhatan understood within a year of their arrival that the English intent was not really trade or fellowship, but to invade his people and possess his country. He moved his home village and capital much further upriver to a place called Orapax. It was not nearly as good for fishing or farming as his old village, but the English could only reach it with the greatest difficulty. He ordered Pocahontas to stop visiting Jamestown. Powhatan took his English boy Thomas with him to Orapax, but Thomas's life became even more of a balancing act. Meanwhile, the Virginia Company back in England was rethinking its mission. After a resupply fleet arrived in Jamestown in January 1608 and found the colonists in dire straits, the company reorganized itself. It had to admit it sent the wrong kind of people to lay the colony's foundation. Funding had to be more secure too. So it opened the membership to the entire British public and organized a large fleet to carry several hundred settlers to reinvigorate Jamestown. But maybe God wanted to send a message. This third fleet, bound for Virginia, ran into a massive hurricane, and its flagship, Sea Venture, barely limped into what the British called the Isle of the Devils, or Bermuda, where so many ships had been marooned on its reefs. The rest of the fleet did eventually make it to Jamestown in the late summer of 1609, but the resupply of food in its holds had been ruined, and the existing colonists did not look forward to sustaining several hundred raw recruits through a barren winter. That winter of 1609-1610 had to be Jamestown's nadir. It became known as a starving time, with widespread deaths punctuated by stories of cannibalism. Relations between the Powhatans and the colonists descended into an endless cycle of distrust and retribution. English delegations seeking food from Chesapeake tribes were met by violent rejection. In turn, the English burned villages and slaughtered innocents to enforce a doctrine of preemptive war. Yet the English were a determined bunch. Investors in the Virginia Company were convinced that commercial advantages would eventually be realized in the New World. Perhaps a network of rivers would open travel across the continent to the Pacific. Maybe mines of gold and silver would be discovered in the interior like the Spanish found. The colony still hadn't made any money, but that didn't stop the English from sending more ships. A fourth fleet commanded by Samuel Argall crossed the Atlantic in a record 57 days and landed at Jamestown in July 1612. Then a strange event occurred that ultimately changed the English fortunes in the most unpredictable way. Argall and a band of colonists had to range further than the immediate tribal lands around Jamestown in search of food. In March 1613, they sailed north to the Potomac River and found that Pocahontas was there with King Patawamek, also known as Iapassus. She had accompanied a trading embassy to his tribal territory. In a convoluted plot, Argall bribed Iapassus to lure Pocahontas onto an English ship so he could kidnap her and take her back to Jamestown to use as a bargaining chip with her father, Chief Powhatan. For his deceit, Iapassus received a copper pot and other trifles. Argall informed Powhatan his daughter was a prisoner and could be ransomed for greater supplies of food. Powhatan called Argall's bluff. His reply was non-committal, and then he remained quiet for the next year. Pocahontas's captivity at Jamestown was not exactly ball and chain. She knew many colonists from previous visits. Two of the English boys, Thomas and Henry, had returned from their years embedded with the Powhatans and could easily speak her language. Alexander Whitaker, a recent graduate of Cambridge University, began to teach Pocahontas the rudiments of Christianity and the appeal of baptism. And Puritan John Rolfe, whose wife had died years earlier, fell in love with Pocahontas and debated whether he could marry a heathen. Once while asleep, God offered Rolfe an option. Why not endeavor to make her a Christian? That, in essence, killed two birds with one stone. In the spring of 1614, Pocahontas renounced publicly her country idolatry and openly confessed her Christian faith. Rebecca was the name she was given at her baptism. It evoked the beginnings. Next slide. Dave, next slide. Rebecca was the name given at her baptism. It evoked the beginning of the people of Israel in Genesis, and the colony's leaders saw an aspiration for which the colony might strive, the conversion of all her peoples. John Rolfe married Pocahontas, and her father sent word accepting the marriage, but he asked her uncle to represent him at the ceremony. Chief Powhatan never set foot at Jamestown during his lifetime. The partnership made a huge impact on the colony, but it had little to do with the marriage or Christian conversion. Rolfe may have smuggled a sweet and possibly illegal strain of South American tobacco seeds from Bermuda, where years earlier he was shipwrecked. Up until this point, Spain had controlled tobacco on the European markets. Smoking, however, was becoming popular in England, where users called it drinking smoke. Rolfe experimented with growing the plant and sent the first shipments of tobacco to England in 1614. The real credit, according to historian Kupperman, should go to Pocahontas for showing him how to cultivate and cure the crop on a large commercial scale. Tobacco cultivation was very different from English farming and involved painstaking work. The Indians sowed the seeds in late winter and transplanted the sprouts in spring. They planted corn around the tobacco to shade the growing plants and discourage weeds. At harvest time, planters had to know just when the crop was ripe. They attached the leaves to poles and hung them from rails to finish curing. Pocahontas knew all this because she worked in the fields with the rest of the Powhatan women. She did not lead a privileged life as the chief's daughter. Under the tutelage of Pocahontas, John Rolfe produced sweet scented tobacco. It became the gold the colonists had sought from the beginning. Tobacco made Virginia sustainable as an enterprise. Now the colony had money for supplies, and new colonists could be brought in at a faster pace and on a broader scale and put to productive work. Beyond tobacco, though, the Virginia Company felt it essential to promote the success and future possibilities of Jamestown to all of England. In 1616, Pocahontas and John Rolfe, who now had a child named Thomas, were brought to London. She came as Lady Rebecca Rolfe, the daughter of Indian royalty. Accompanying them was an entourage of Powhatans. One of the English boys, Henry Spelman, was their interpreter. Pocahontas was treated as a dignitary and celebrity. She was inveigled into wearing the clothing of an English noblewoman, a corset of whalebone, a petticoat, a high-bodied gown with wings, a starched collar. It must have been incredibly uncomfortable, both physically and psychologically. One advantage of the elaborate dress, it covered her tattoos. She and her people were put up in an inn near St. Paul's Cathedral in a bustling part of the city. London had grown to a metropolis of 200,000, cramped, smelly, dirty, and noisy. The Powhatans had to look at their surroundings and ask themselves, is this really what their white hosts called civilization? An engraved portrait of Pocahontas was rushed into print. These inexpensive engravings were the social media of their day, seen by people of all classes. Immediately beneath her portrait, in a felt hat of beaver no less, was a ribbon of text in Latin saying she was in her 21st year, the daughter of a mighty prince, conferred and baptized in the Christian faith, the daughter of and the wife of worthy Mr. John Rolfe. She and her retinue were graciously received at royal court and treated to a masque or allegorical play written by the esteemed Ben Jonson. The king, James I, was in attendance. One of the ironies was that a kinsman with Pocahontas, a Powhatan chief priest, refused to believe that the unimpressive man he had met at the play was actually monarch to the world's most powerful nation. James was a preening peacock who paled in comparison to the Powhatan head of state. The Virginia Company milked Pocahontas's visit for all it was worth. King James had ordered the archbishops of Canterbury and York to direct every parish in England to take up a collection to set up schools and churches for the education of the barbarian children in the wilds of Virginia. As Pocahontas and her party were set to sail back home, she was given 300 pounds to be used to convert all Powhatans to Christianity. Imagine the ambivalence and stress that caused her. She had accepted a new spiritual life herself, but to proselytize an entire people, that was a huge burden. As the ship carrying her home sailed down the Thames, she died from either pneumonia or tuberculosis. Pocahontas, Lady Rebecca, was buried in the chancel of St. George's Church in Gravesend on March 21st, 1617. Burial in the chancel was reserved for people of high rank. A few historians speculate she died of a broken heart. This could be academics imposing their secular bias on a strong-minded woman torn between two worlds. She was not one to share her confidences. Her young son Thomas also took ill before the ship left English waters. The ship stopped at Plymouth in Western England so he could be dropped off with his uncle Henry. Thomas never would see his father, John Rolfe, again. John died soon after returning to Jamestown. How did England's first colonial venture fare after running the gauntlet of its first decade? Tobacco had indeed altered its fortunes. Its export provided an assured source of income. Backers in England became committed to trying to build a true English society in Virginia. Colonists were given their own piece of land to work as they saw fit. Some say the first real stab at American capitalism. A General Assembly was formed to make laws. A great charter was approved, echoing England's own foundational Magna Carta. With the tobacco trade flourishing, Jamestown burst its fortified walls. Plantations spread all along the James River, and hundreds of servants were brought over to work the fields. Women resembling mail-order brides were lured to immigrate. Children off the streets of London were offered a chance to start a productive life 3,000 miles away. The population began to reach critical mass. Native communities were pushed back away from their waterways that had been their lifeblood, and the nature of Indian life was radically disrupted. Chief Paladin died in 1618. His successor, Opchencanal, was a competent leader, but suddenly tribes felt outmanned and could not entirely agree on how to respond. Finally, on Good Friday, 1622, the Palatins launched an ambitious attack on all English sites in an effort to wipe them off the face of the land. Although hundreds of colonists were killed, the effort was too late. The siege lasted 10 years, but the English had planted deep enough roots that they were in the New World to stay. What happened to the English boy translators and emissaries implanted with the native tribes? Samuel Collier and Henry Spelman were killed during the Indian uprising. Henry had lived 28 years and was admittedly the best linguist of the Indian tongue in Virginia. But he had paid a price for all the duplicity that passed between the natives and the colonists over the course of the early years. Henry had been caught in the middle, and in the end was trusted by neither faction. When he reached adulthood and was no longer a go-between, Thomas Savage began to align with the Accomack Indians on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake. Opchencanal was not pleased with his abandonment of the Palatins and plotted to kill him. He was warned by Chief Esme Shikans of the Accomacs. His loyalty and commercial interest shifted to the Eastern Shore tribes, and he was granted 9,000 acres by Chief Shikans. When he died in 1635, his lucrative estate passed on to his wife. Robert Poole stayed in Jamestown and encountered serious financial difficulty. He extracted himself from debt by entering the fur trade further north. He was eventually granted 300 acres near what is now Newport News. Thomas Rolfe, the son of Pocahontas and John, grew up in England but returned to Virginia in 1635. He married an English woman and took up the substantial lands his father had left him. He made his choice to become an English settler and never really made contact with the people on his mother's side. Rumors of corruption and inefficiency finally did in the Virginia Company. The royal government moved to revoke the company's charter in 1625. It had outlived its usefulness. By the 1630s, the English outnumbered the natives along the Chesapeake. Further north in New England, the Pilgrims arrived in the Mayflower in 1620 and struggled to lay down their own roots. Gradually, through the haze of battling the elements, the indigenous people, and its own uncertainty about the wisdom of expansion, England was well on its way to becoming a global empire. Pocahontas and the English boys provided fascinating narratives to the beginning of America as we know it. You can feel deep pangs of remorse for how the natives, like the Paladins, were treated. But the reality in the march of history has always been one of discovery, displacement, and development. Woven into it all is heartache, cruelty, mythology, and hard-earned momentum. That was the story of early America. It's the story of mankind's drive to tame our untamable planet. There will always be Pocahontases and English boys marking the mystical paths along the way. And that is it. Any questions?
Craig, that was beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would agree. That's an excellent survey of history.
Well done, Craig.
Excuse me?
Well done.
Thank you.
Do we have any idea what happened to Thomas Rolfe?
Thomas Rolfe, he just remained in Jamestown and lived as an Englishman. He was given lands by his father, John, and became very wealthy, I believe.
That area down there at Newport News, is that it?
Yeah.
Newport? Well, I was in the Army down there at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and there was an Air Force base, a naval station. It was a more military-oriented place than I've ever seen in my life. The military down there is all over the world, all over the place in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention much about the slaves. Do you have any additional information about their lives in the colonies?
Well, interestingly, the first slaves, as you might call them, or indentured servants, were English people brought to man the plantations, and they came in large numbers, and they were workers, indentured servants, not exactly slaves. I mean, they served, I don't know, 7 years as indentured servants, and then buy their freedom. But so actually, the first slaves or servants to come to man those plantations were white Englishmen, basically. They were then later the first African slaves came, but it wasn't until maybe 16, 19, 20, around there. That was the first shipment of African slaves, I believe. So they were actually the people that manned the plantations. Most of the grunt work were Englishmen at the beginning, and they were indentured servants.
Brad? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Why do you think we don't know more about this? Like I was saying, we learned about it in second grade and then I stopped learning about it.
What, Jamestown?
Yeah. I mean, I learned, yeah, go ahead.
I can't tell you. I thought it was a fascinating part of history that I didn't. The fact that both sides, the English and the Powhatans, used young people as emissaries and go-betweens and translators was news to me. And this book I read was very detailed because she had used a number of sources to find out about them. But it was a side of history that I thought was fascinating, that both sides figured out how to evaluate and check out the other side in a fashion that was, I guess, yeah, I'm not deployed elsewhere in the world.
Did anybody come out a winner here?
What's that?
Was anybody a winner? You know, you have win, win, lose, lose, that sort of thing. I'm trying to think. I don't know. It's interesting. I didn't know this.
Well, from what happened to all the young people, they were put in harm's way, all of them, and they all suffered to a degree. Well, a couple got killed, and Pocahontas died on her way home, but they all suffered, you know, the ultimate price. They all paid the ultimate price for their participation in these interchanges between the two sides.
A lot of people have joked that what happened to the Indians shows the perils of having the wrong immigration policy. But in terms of diseases, you know, we hear that you know, European diseases came and decimated the Indians. There must have been other diseases that Europeans were susceptible to that the Indians weren't. You know, I guess maybe the revenge was tobacco that's killed millions and millions of Europeans. But, you know, was there anything in the book about the exchange of diseases?
No, I didn't hear anything about either side being inflicted by diseases at that point. You know, maybe it came later after the huge numbers of, or large numbers of English and other Europeans came to North America. But no, there was no mention of disease affecting either side. It was just animosity, warfare between the sides when the Indians found out what the true intentions of the English were. And
I suspect that the primary killers were measles and tuberculosis, probably measles more than TB. But the English survivors who came to Jamestown probably had antibodies because of herd immunity, which we've heard about. Because herd immunity in those days was the only way to control an epidemic.
mm-hmm.
And by the time everybody developed antibodies, half of the population was dead, but the others survived.
Well, it was
The Indians had no
It was interesting the way the English adapted.
Um,
I mean, the English sent the ship first.
I was just going to say that it's interesting that within a week of some Hungarian and but
I mean, the
she
English
died quickly.
their first.
Craig, how many books are written about Jamestown and that experience?
This was the first one I ever encountered, and I think this was original research by New York professor. Went back and found journals and accounts and over this ability to original research. The first time I've ever heard of anything like this about the embedded English word. And Pocahontas is true intention. My father was to find out more about what was happening inside the fort. And, so he was very clever by sending her in there with an entourage. He was very young at the time. So it's really the first time I think about this kind of interaction between the two sides.
How, do you have any feeling how the Native American population views this view of what happened?
Excuse me?
Do you have any feeling for how the Native American population views this analysis of what happened? I don't expect you to have that, but I mean, it'd be interesting to know. Are there different points of view?
Yeah. Well,
I'm just musing, I guess, but
apparently knew the English intentions fairly early, and you know, their initial reaction was to live with them, put up with them, then try to exterminate them. When none of those actions were effective, they sort of moved away from the English, and the English sort of took over the Chesapeake area that they had settled in. And I know the Powhatans at one time were a confederacy of 25,000 Indians, but by the time the English had established substantial roots there in the 1630s and 40s, the Powhatans had been reduced in the number of people, and they had been separated from their initial tribal locations. So
they went from a majority to a minority, didn't they?
yes. In the matter of, like, I would say probably 30 to 40 years. Yeah.
I've been to Jamestown a couple times with a span of maybe 30 years in between. And if you go there now, there's a lot more in the museum and everything about the Powhatan cultures. I recall you did a speech on, or a presentation on Jim Thorpe, and you know, there was that period in American history where the Indians culture was trying to be wiped out. But now historians are starting to give more attention to the Indians. I know if you go to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they finally included a lot more history about the Indians and their tribes and what they accomplished, and it wasn't just Custer and the 7th Cavalry anymore. So that's a good trend that's happening to show, all sides of the conflict, and it's even happening with the Civil War, where in some cases it's gone the other direction, where people want to eliminate Confederate monuments on battlefields and things like that.
Yeah.
The trends in history, go back and flow back and forth among the historians.
Well, this book gave the Powhatans a great deal of respect. Chief Powhatan was considered a very adept leader, and it was interesting that the English boys embedded into the Indians and to live with them came to see their side of the picture, and they were very reticent to do some of the things that the English wanted them to do, like lie during translations, and so they were caught between two cultures that just didn't were never going to integrate, but they saw the effect of the lifestyle of the Indians as being very worthy of their respect, and that's the way the book treated the Powhatans. It wasn't one-sided at all. It was they extended or this writer extended a great deal of respect to the Indians as a force to be reckoned with until they were outgunned.
There's a phrase, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Okay.
And you can see that in terms of human interaction, everything that happened there. Things like that still happen today, don't they?
Well, story of power, I guess.
Craig, I want to thank you for a really interesting presentation. I agree with Dan. We grew up in Virginia. We spent 18 years there. I've been to Jamestown about 10 or 12 times, and watched that sort of grow from a very small little thing to just a fantastic visitor center. And it's well worth the visit if you haven't been there. I learned a lot today, so thank you for that. I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
I guess one takeaway message is they should have had more women in that original group.
Like the first picture.
Yeah.
The closest I came to Jamestown, Virginia is I grew up in Jamestown, New York. So
Thank you very much, Craig. It was great.
Beautifully done. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome. Thank you. See you later.
yeah,
Good meeting.
Craig.
Thank you.
Bye now.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.
Bye.